On January 17, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. And immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But he actually did not want that, and so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run, but Gary was not about to run, and what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair, and then when he reached the chair, he sat down. The guards that had walked him in and began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair. Gary didn't put up a fight, and on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of this space. It was like this big curtain that was protecting something on the other side. He saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain, and even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. And then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready. And then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution, in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so for hours they sat there pitching different ideas, but nothing really felt right. He suddenly has this epiphany. He just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news, and Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. He remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. It literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words, "Just do it." Dan's client, that small business, was Nike.